As Clark High's first transgender student, he's not allowed to use the boys' room.
James is not being unreasonable. He is standing up for his rights. As a transgender male.
I'm just trying to understand the public policy and the rights issue. You go to the men or the women's room and you make a decision. What does this have to do with those kind of decisions? This back and forth we've had here from Obama to Trump in terms of which room you're supposed to go into?
Well, my friend Chase Strangia, who works at the ACLU, says this so brilliantly, that these anti-trans bathroom bills are not really about bathrooms. They're about whether or not we want and believe that trans people have a right to exist in public space. It's really about us not existing, about erasing trans people. When trans people can't access public bathrooms, we can't go to schools effectively, go to work effectively, access healthcare facilities.
The Trump administration officials are considering legally defining gender as somebody's biological sex at birth, a move that could roll back civil rights protections for transgender Americans. According to the Times, the memo reads in parts, sex means a person's status as male or female based on immutable biological traits identifiable by, on, before birth. The sex listed on a person's birth certificate as originally issued shall constitute definitive proof of a person's sex unless rebutted by reliable genetic evidence. A 2016 study out of UCLA estimated about 1.4 million Americans identify as transgender.
We just heard from President Trump here on the South Lawn of the White House a little while ago, and he said, relating to this New York Times story, that it is something that they are looking at and taking seriously.
I'm protecting everybody. You know what I'm doing? I'm protecting everybody. I want to protect our country.
As for defining trans people out of existence, what a lot of people don't know is this has been done many times before. In Europe, before World War II, there was a thriving queer and trans community that existed, especially within Berlin. And what happened was when the Nazis rose to power, they decided that wasn't good. And they quite literally erased us from that part of history.
I want to hear stories about myself or people like myself. And the narrative in Western culture is that basically trans people didn't exist until about 10 years ago. Now, obviously, this is a load of crap. It's true that words like transgender and even transsexual are quite recent. But to say that trans people didn't exist until the word trans was invented is a bit like saying gay people didn't exist until the word homosexual was invented in 1869. Dr. Alan L. Hart. This is one case where I think there's just no excuse to call him anything other than a trans man, since he underwent both surgical and hormonal transition and referred to himself as a man even with people he was out as trans to. But for some baffling reason, a lot of people have still argued that he was a lesbian. I mean, I would argue that taking testosterone, having your womb and ovaries removed, and referring to yourself as a man for 40 years are all fairly strong indicators that somebody identifies as a man. So Alan was born in 1890, and he was one of the first trans men in the US to have a hysterectomy. He was also a brilliant radiologist who spent most of his career researching and treating tuberculosis. He pioneered the use of X-rays in detecting tuberculosis, which allowed it to be detected much earlier, which often saved the patient's life. By the 1940s, the use of his techniques in detecting TB had helped cut the tuberculosis death rate down to a 50th of what it had been.
On November 8th this year, which is the birthday of not the first recorded intersex person, but certainly one of the most famous early, Herculine Barbenche. She was born in France on November 8th in 1838. She lived until February of 1868. It was a very short life. She was only 30, and she was educated in a convent school for girls. And it was noted from a young age that she seemed to have, she formed crushes on many of her classmates, the other girls. And by the time she hit what should have been puberty, it was noted that she had not begun to menstruate and that she was very flat-chested and even had a little bit of facial hair. Herculine confessed to a priest and requested that the priest have a doctor come to examine her. And the doctor's report said that Herculine had ambiguous genitalia. So at that point in medical history, she is what they would have classified as male pseudo-hermaphroditism, which means the appearance of having both male and female organs, except only the testes are present. Of course, you have the figure in Greek mythology, Hermaphroditus, which is depicted, in a lot of classical art and Renaissance art as usually a figure that looks, for the most part, like a beautiful woman will have breasts and then a dick and balls. You know, like it's that very oversimplified that's what a hermaphrodite must look like, because that is what classical iconography used as notation for that mythological and of course the mythological figure is based on, yes, in Greece and Rome and ancient Egypt and the medieval world and the Renaissance, and intersex people have always been documented. There are records almost as far back as human written records that, yeah, there were intersex people, and even some ancient societies recognized them as a third biological sex. Go figure. It's amazing what we managed to forget. So they had these gradations. They were able to distinguish between the phenotypical differences externally versus what they could observe on the inside. Now for Herculine, this meant that she was legally reclassified as a man and had to leave her post at the school. And she spent about the last 8 years of her life living in extreme poverty. She spent her last 8 years writing her memoirs, being forced to go by a male name and use male pronouns, but she called herself she and her in her memoirs up until the day that she committed suicide. It is not a very happy story.
But one community in particular is pushing through a complex past and looking towards a transforming future. They are Hijra, India's ancient transgender community. Hijra are now a politically recognized third gender, a category of people whose identity is neither male nor female. In India, Hijra have a recorded history of more than 4,000 years. Royal courts held them in high regard, and sacred Hindu texts described them in bright sari and delicate jewelry, bestowing them with special powers to bring luck and fertility.
Hi, my name is Charlie, and I'm a Two-Spirit drag queen. Two-Spirit is an umbrella term used to describe queer Native American people. We walk in between being feminine and masculine.
For me, it's a cultural term more than anything else, as it relates to Native and Indigenous tribe. It was a very foreign concept to create an identity based on your sexual expression, because every tribe had their own word for what it meant to be kind of like two-spirit or, you know, gay or lesbian and stuff.
Now you have to remember there are more than 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States. So the term queer varied from tribe to tribe, such as Natle, Wingde, Agokwe, and Akukua. By the time the 1980s rolled around, we started calling ourselves two-spirits, as opposed to that old, clanky scientific term that anthropologists used to call us. Berdash?
It's possible to have an intersex variation that is solely a hormonal one, or you might have one where there's a difference in your chromosomes. You might be XXY instead of XY or XX, and you might also have a hormonal difference along with that, or you might have just a genital ambiguity. So you can see there's a kind of mix and match that can happen with many of these variations. There has been a long history of surgery without parental consent or proper education on intersex infants. If a clitoris is what they would consider a bit too large, maybe resembling a small penis, they will urge the parents into a state of believing that this constitutes a social emergency and that doing a reduction of the tissue will be the best thing. Individuals who have undergone these surgeries as infants have suffered damage to their bodily function and autonomy, and so we're seeing a move worldwide. A number of countries have made these surgeries illegal. They're right up there, honestly, with genital mutilation.
Lou Sullivan is a bit more recent, but he's one that I personally relate to quite a bit. He was born in 1951, and he was one of the first, if not the first, trans men to publicly identify as gay. At the time that he was coming out in the 70s, it was thought that it was impossible for trans people to be gay, and it was on the list of counter-indicators that basically disqualified somebody from being able to access sex reassignment surgery. He was denied hormones and surgery for years because he identified as a gay man. He did eventually manage to get on hormones in 1979, and he got a mastectomy in 1980. And after that, he campaigned to have homosexuality taken off the list of counterindicators for sex reassignment surgery, and eventually that campaign was successful. He was a major activist in the trans community. Lou Sullivan was diagnosed with HIV in 1986. After his diagnosis, he wrote, "I took a certain pleasure in informing the gender clinic that even though their program told me I could not live as a gay man, it looks like I'm going to die like one."
If they erase transgender, then they will also be erasing intersex people. There is probably an almost infinite array of variations for biological sex, and therefore it parallels the infinite array of genders that we see. So if you legislate that there is only male biological sex and only female, then you discount me and however many thousands of intersex people there are in this country. The consequences could very well mean that coercive surgeries on infants will become more prevalent again, because parents will feel pressure and anxiety that their child will be illegal by the definition of strict correspondence of one biological sex or the other to one gender or the other, and it would undo decades of hard-won victories and activism. It would do an incredible amount of damage. The many intersex people that in their states have been able to get their birth certificate amended, I think would probably find those documents revert back to what they were originally assigned. The reversions of all these documentation victories, in particular birth certificates, passports, driver's licenses, people thought to be recognized for what and who they are, and they will be classified, they'll be put back in boxes. I would like to see cis allies stand up for us. I would like to see them speak out as stridently as we're trying to do for ourselves, because they're part of the normative structures that have made recognition impossible for so long. And I think that those voices with more power than we have need to support our voices. It needs to matter. Trans rights and intersex rights need to matter to the rest of the population.
I'm going to read you a quote from a New York Times article that really is the one that allowed everybody to understand this was happening. The article, which you can find linked in the description box, says the department argued in its memo that key government agencies needed to adopt an explicit and uniform definition of gender as determined on, quote, a biological basis that is clear, grounded in science, objective, and administrable. Think about this for a minute. Think about the implications of being treated based on the circumstances of your birth. This will extend beyond trans people. This will extend into class issues, race issues, religious backgrounds. Every single circumstance of a person's birth can then, there's precedent to use that against a person in their full-grown adult state. All of this will snowball. It gives precedent for even more horrifying human rights issues. And I don't think that's the only reason. I don't think just because it could get worse, that's not the only reason we should stop it. We should stop it because it's worse now. This is worse.